In today's video, I'm going to go over pivot tables. And the goal of this is just to give you a quick overview if you're new to pivot tables or unsure how they work, just to give you a quick overview of the main points and how to use them and when to use them. And so I've downloaded a data set from the UN that has employment numbers and unemployment numbers by country. And so this is a good data set because there's a lot of data here. There's a lot of fields to choose from. So there's a lot that can be done with this. And the main advantage that pivot tables have over formulas, for example, is that with formulas, if we were trying to summarize this data, we might need to pull in all the unique values from these different fields and then do sum if calculations. And so it could be a bit of a tedious process. With pivot tables, you can quickly jump ahead and do all that analysis in a much shorter time frame. And to create a pivot table is really simple. All I need to do is click on my data set anywhere, and on the Insert menu, Insert tab, click on the Pivot Table button. That's really all there is to it, to creating a pivot table. The main thing is to specify whether I want to put in a new worksheet or an existing one. I'm going to select existing because I've already set up a pivot table tab here. So if I click on this location, click in Pivot Table, select A1, hit Enter. Okay, and now my pivot table is created. But right now it's a bit of a blank canvas because I haven't moved any of these fields around. So there's a couple different areas here. We've got filters, columns, rows, and values. So values, these are where you're going to want your numbers. You're not going to want any text values in here. Filters are only going to be, if you want to drill down the data by certain values. So for instance, here I've got countries. If I had another field, another column that had continents, I may want to filter in by that. I could also filter by country as well, but the main fields they're going to use are rows, columns, and values. And so for the rows, what I generally consider, when looking at what to put in rows versus columns, is the number of values in that column. So if you're looking at months of the year where there's only going to be 12, then that's not a terribly large number. So that can be put into something like columns, just because anytime you're dealing with a small number of different values, then you want to put that into your columns because it's easier to scroll left to right. Easier to scroll up and down than it is left to right. Plus, there are more rows than there are columns. So values like the country, for instance, that I want to put into the rows. So if I click on this, by default, Excel will put that into the rows section. Now I can also select year, description, magnitude, or value. So the value, I can click on this, and Excel knows that that's a numerical value, so it's putting that by default into the values section. Now, the one problem with this is that right now, this is grouping all of these numbers together. It's taking a summation of all this. So it's grouping unemployment with employment with labor force. So all those numbers are being summed together. And that's obviously not what I want. And a quick way to double check what is making up that cell, making up these values, is just to double click on it. So if I double click on this, I see exactly what's making up these values. And here I've got still percentages being added in. I've got thousands. I've got all these different fields being mixed together, which I don't want. So I'm going to delete that. And what I'm going to want to do is filter this out a little bit. And that's where I can use this magnitude field. So I pull this into the filters. And I can filter out that I only want the thousands. I don't want to mix in percentages or index numbers, just the thousands. I hit OK. And now my numbers change. Now when I double click on this value, I only have the thousands. And for the descriptions, now I have the employment, labor force, and unemployment numbers. I don't have any of those percentages in there again. So delete this one more time. And so now I've got something a bit more workable, but I still need to split those descriptions up. So if I click on description, it's going to put it underneath here, which could work, but a better option would be to put it on columns because I'm only dealing with 3 different values here. So going across is going to work pretty well. And so now we've already got a nice table here. And by default, Excel likes to put in a grand total for me. Now, grand totals are nice in some cases, but I don't need them in this instance. So I can just right click, remove grand total. And now I've got employment, labor force, and unemployment. If I select and double click, that'll automatically expand this. One thing with these pivot tables is by default, they may not format to exactly how you want them to look. For instance, these numbers are fairly large, so it's hard to tell, when you're looking at thousands or millions or whatever that number is. So I can right click, value field settings, and then under number format, select number, use 1000 separator, and get rid of the decimal places. Hit OK, and that'll update these fields for me. So now the numbers are a lot easier to read and to visualize. Another thing we could do here is pull the year in and put it under the different countries. So now we can have a country's historical numbers showing up in here. So we can see this one only goes up to 2008. And as you can see, we run into the same sort of issue where that these totals are being totaled, right? So I'm adding all these values together. So this adds up to 33 million. And so this is a bit of a misleading number because it's adding all those years. That's not what I want. Because if I look at these values, it's doing a summation. So if I were to click on this and go back to value field settings, I can change this to say, okay, let's do an average maybe. Average of all those years. Right now that looks a bit more reasonable because now instead of just summing all that up, I'm actually just taking an average. So this is where you want to make sure that whatever that calculation is, whatever that value is, that it's doing what you want it to do. Because a pivot table is great, but it can add everything up, and that's may not be what you want it to do. So always make sure to check what that computation is. One quirk with pivot tables that I think a lot of users get frustrated with is by default, Excel puts it in this format where you've got, the field and then the other field below it, and you don't have both on the same line. So it can be a little bit frustrating if you're trying to, let's say, to do a sum ifs calculation and pull in both these values, because how could you select the country and the year as well? It gets a bit messy trying to do that. And so what we can do is change the layout of the report. So I go to report layout and show in tabular form. When I do this, now you can see now we've got the country and now the year. The one thing still missing is these values are blank. So what I can do is here, report layout, and select repeat all item labels. Now when I do this, now I've got a nice setup where I've got the country, the year, and so now it's a lot easier to do a sum ifs calculation to pull these values in so that I don't have to do any more complex calculations to get the values that I want. A few of the cool things that you can do with pivot tables involves slicers. So if I go back to the insert tab and then click on the slicer button, what I can do is select any fields that I want to filter by. So let's say country or year. And now I've got these slicers, which this is the same thing as if you were to use a drop down on your data set. So for instance, if I went in here and said I just only want to look at a certain country, I could use the drop down to select that one. Slicers work the same way in the sense that, okay, let's say I just want to select one country. Now I'm only going to see the totals for that one. If I hit Control and click multiple ones, now release Control, now I've got just those that I've selected in here. So that's one of the cool things about slicers. It makes it easy to have the user select, whatever values or whatever fields they want to filter by. So if I want to ignore these older values, let's say I just want to look at the countries that have data from 2009, now I've got all these different countries. And, one of the annoying things that you have sometimes with pivot tables is it automatically totals these up. So again, if you want to remove these totals, right click and then uncheck subtotal country area. And now I've got a much cleaner setup where I just see the totals by year. And of course, the user can go back and reset these settings back to here. And you can also collapse these as well. So if I want to have all these in here, but I don't want to see them all the time, I can click on this to collapse it. And if I right click on this, I can select to collapse the entire field. And now I've got all of these countries collapsed. So now you'll see I don't have the year in here when I do so. So I'd have to open this back up to see that. So if you want to collapse it, you can, but then you don't have that year value in there. So that's a quick overview of pivot tables and how you can summarize your data. I tried to keep this to about 10 minutes. And just a quick overview. So let me know in the comments if you found it useful, if there's things you would have liked to seen covered. And other than that, thanks for watching.